Once we got the light in our scene and we've made a first pass at setting up the exposure control, we can do some test renders. The default renderer in 3ds Max is the scanline renderer, and that is a pretty fast but also inaccurate renderer, and it actually appeared in the very first version of 3ds Max. And if you just need something quick and dirty, then you can use that scanline renderer. But when you're ready to do something that looks good, then you'll want to use a more advanced renderer such as Mental Ray. Mental Ray actually is a great renderer, but it takes a very long time to set up. There are many, many variables to a Mental Ray renderer, and it's relatively fast to render a good quality, realistic result, but the setup time is sometimes onerous. Well, now Autodesk has introduced a new renderer. It's called ART, or Autodesk Ray Tracer, and it's a completely physically based renderer, and it depends upon the complexity of your scene. The more complex your scene is, the longer it's going to take to render because it needs to calculate all the diffuse reflections among surfaces. In other words, how light is bouncing around surfaces to hit other surfaces. And for that reason, I've stripped down my loft apartment here so that the only thing that's actually visible in the scene is what my perspective view can see. Anything outside of the frame of that perspective view is hidden because the ART renderer will take everything in the scene into account, even if it's not directly visible to the camera, because it wants to calculate all of the diffuse reflections between all the surfaces, even if they're not visible to the camera lens. Let's see the difference between the scanline renderer and the ART renderer. I'll give focus to that perspective view and click on the Render Production button, and we'll get a scanline render. It's very fast, but very inaccurate. And we can see that the lampshade's actually not casting a shadow, and that's because the surface is pointing outward. If it were a two-sided material, then the scanline renderer would be able to cast a shadow. These shadows here, these lines, are actually a couple of pieces of trim around the top and bottom of that lampshade. All right, so the scanline renderer is very fast but very inaccurate. Now let's try the ART renderer. We'll go into the Render Setup dialog, and at the top here we can choose our renderer. Switch that from scanline to ART. Then we can go into the ART renderer tab and control the quality. And the quality is measured in the units of decibels. That's a logarithmic unit. And if we increase the quality up from draft to, let's say, high, we see it go from 20 decibels to 33 decibels. Because that's a logarithmic scale, 33 decibels is actually a lot more accurate by many factors. It's not just a linear scale. So a small amount of change here is going to have a large amount of result when you actually render. You'll see the quality difference be really extreme. I'm going to set this back down to the default draft quality of 20, and we'll do a test render with ART. Click on the Render button either here in the Render Setup dialog or in the Open Rendered Frame window. ART is a progressive renderer, and the longer you let it go, the less grain you'll have. And here it is. It's looking pretty grainy there at draft quality. I'll increase that quality up to high. Let's give it 33 decibels, and we'll do another rendering. And it's going to do the exact same thing. It's just going to do more iterations. It's going to calculate longer, and the longer it calculates, the better the quality is going to be, and the less grain we will see. Now again, the complexity of the scene, the number of objects in the scene, the number of lights in the scene is going to have a great deal of influence on how many calculations need to take place and what the resulting quality will be. And even seemingly innocent things such as the position of a light can have a vast influence over the render time. Here in this example, I've placed the light above the lampshade. And because of that, it's not going to take that long to render, maybe a minute or so. But in fact, if I place the light inside the lamp, that would suddenly cause a lot more render calculations to be required. And my render time would instantly go from about a minute to do a high quality render to something like 15 minutes to do a high quality render. simply by moving the light inside that lampshade. Be aware that, again, the ART renderer, because it's physically based, has got some real special considerations, and you want to make sure that you're prepared for some potentially very long render times. Some of the renderings that I did for this course, when I had a fully lit and fully populated scene with materials on all the objects, some of those renderings took all day to render. Seriously, like 6-9 hours for a single frame. So the moral of the story here is that ART is really easy to set up, but depending upon the complexity of your scene and the specifics of how it's laid out, it could be a very, very long wait time for a physically based rendering. All right, so that's the basics of the ART renderer in Max.